colleagues, welcome Mr. Blakey. I don't think it's the first time that you've been at our committee. You've already replaced a colleague before for Ms. Collins. Either way, you're here today and we're very happy to have you. So, moving on.
As a reminder, is there any word on the expenses yet from Dubai?
No, I have not been given anything. I've asked for it. There's only so much I can, I've asked for it. I have not heard back. You haven't heard back, obviously. Okay. So it's noted that you're requesting the expenses of the minister's delegation from the Dubai COP 28. Was it 28? Was 28? 28. And so we'll I've made a note, mentioned it here publicly, so we'll see what happens. Okay. Alors, bienvenue à nos témoins.
Welcome to our witnesses. We have 3 witnesses for the first hour. We have Mr. Scott Higgins, who is a senior research scientist, Experimental Lakes Area. From the Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition, we have Claire Malcolmson, who's the executive director. And from Rivers Foundation, we have André Bélanger, the general manager. Each witness has 5 minutes to present their thoughts. And we will start with Mr. Higgins, who is online.
You have 5 minutes to give an opening statement.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and honorable committee members. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. My name is Dr. Scott Higgins. I'm a senior research scientist at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Experimental Lakes Area. I'm pleased to be speaking to you today from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'm very honored to provide testimony to this committee on behalf of my organization. This is a very important topic and affects all sectors and peoples of Canada. The IISD Experimental Lakes Area has played an important role in understanding and providing scientific guidance for policymakers, managers, and industry, and the public for over 50 years, first within the federal government, and now as a nonprofit research-based organization. As our name implies, we focus on freshwater issues that affect Canadians, and we have years of experience on research, monitoring, and data, which is what I will speak about today. In respect to the federal responsibility for water, we recommend that a priority of the Canada Water Agency is to develop a national water strategy that would include facilitating collaboration across jurisdictions and sectors, improving access to national freshwater data, and facilitating priority areas of research. Given the importance of water to all sectors and peoples of Canada, a national water strategy is of strong national interest. In respect to research, I would like to start by highlighting that Canada is recognized as a world leader in freshwater science. Our research at the IISD Experimental Lakes Area and those of our colleagues at Canadian academic and government institutions have made significant global contributions to understanding the impacts and risks to freshwater systems and providing science-based management and policy solutions. An important driver of my organization's success has been the highly collaborative nature of our research, which includes academic and government researchers, Indigenous peoples, industry, NGOs, and other stakeholders. We have found that this collaborative model helps break down barriers, is highly cost-effective, and leads to strong management and policy outcomes. For this reason, we feel a key role of the Canada Water Agency should be to facilitate collaboration between government departments at all levels and the many stakeholders in the water sector to undertake activities required for managing the complex nature of Canada's water systems. We recommend that the federal government, through the Canada Water Agency, should take a leadership role in identifying issues at the regional and national scales that require further research and facilitate the creation of national collaborative teams to tackle them. This would require coordination of funding from government, private sources, and programs, many of which already exist but are fragmented across different agencies. In respect to monitoring, we recommend that a national water strategy include routine national assessments of lake, stream, and groundwater. Routine national water assessments are an issue of national security and importance. Without them, we are not able to understand the state of our freshwater systems and identify risks to the public, to our ecosystems, and to all sectors of our economy. Further, a national monitoring program would help identify emerging issues of regional and national importance where management and policy interventions or further research are needed. This brings me to my final point about data. Currently, water quality data in Canada is widely dispersed across different levels of government and sectors, and it's very challenging to access. Millions and millions of dollars are spent on collecting data, yet it often sits on shelves gathering dust. Canada needs a national database that is open and accessible to everyone. In our experience, the public wants to know about water issues where they live, and this knowledge can help drive effective stewardship. There are examples from other countries on how this has been achieved. There are also great examples from Canada, like DataStream, that bring in data from disparate sources like governments, academics, First Nations, and community groups and provide it in an accessible way to scientists, managers, and the public. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Higgins. We'll go now to Ms. Malcolmson for 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Bonjour. Thank you very much for the very last minute invitation to join this committee. I'm the executive director of the Rescued Lake Simcoe Coalition. Lake Simcoe is in a sort of an art map behind me. Southern Ontario, an hour north of Toronto. It's really the poster child for the impacts of development on a lake. And I think that it's the most intensively studied lake in Canada, as far as I know, with the exception probably of the experimental lakes. But really, I'm here to talk about the fact that there are so many interrelated, interjurisdictional, multi-jurisdictional issues that data alone, although it is important, does not solve these problems. You know, we have watershed legislation at Lake Simcoe that should be protecting the lake, and yet the targets that we are trying to achieve, most of them continue to be further and further out of our grasp. And so really what I want to impress on the committee here is the very serious need for the federal government to act on the policies that you already have. And I'm speaking to, in particular, impacts to Lake Simcoe from the Bradford Bypass Highway. So that's kind of my overview. I'm just going to step back a little bit and acknowledge that Lake Simcoe is in the territory of the Williams Treaties First Nations. There are 2 First Nations that currently reside on the lake, and one of them, the Georgina Island First Nation, is one of our 30 member groups. I'm not speaking on their behalf, but we learn from each other and have really developed relationships, and I think we have a lot to learn from our First Nations. I hope they're coming to this committee too. So there are numbers of things in my brief, which I wrote this morning, that I really applaud the federal government for taking action on. I think it's really important to recognize land use affects water more than anything else. And so I really appreciate, in particular, tying affordable housing money to municipal density bylaws. And that's because at Lake Simcoe, where we have 500,000 people living in the watershed, including the cities of Barrie, Orillia, Newmarket, and Bradford, sprawl is the biggest growing impact that we have on Lake Simcoe. It, of course, also overlaps with another federal priority, which I really appreciate, which is reducing the impacts of climate change and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. We have to do that to save Lake Simcoe. We have to do that to save our climate. We also have to do that to protect our water from the impacts of salt pollution, which is a huge issue, which we've really just taken up in a serious way in the last couple of months. I'm talking about land use planning and how these activities interact with water quality. So just for the Bradford Bypass Highway, for example, we know we didn't get an impact assessment. Okay, we tried hot twice. We know the impact assessment tool is a bit of a hot topic. So leaving that aside, we're still really concerned that our waters are not protected. So the Bradford bypass proponents have identified in their fisheries information that they found the American eel. So another area of federal jurisdiction, this endangered species. This was identified by the First Nations, another area of federal jurisdiction. We have reviewed all this information and find that it's really lacking. So I'm going to be sending a letter to the DFO. Currently, the DFO is saying we are going to wait to see if we are asked to review this information. And I'm submitting that that's the wrong approach. That when we have a really big project that is frankly not appropriate for the 21st century, it's a 16-kilometer highway over 13 water bodies, one of which is currently choked with salt already, that it's just not appropriate to let a project like that go ahead. And clearly everyone's removed the brakes in Ontario, in the government of Ontario. The guardrails are being dismantled. So we really need the federal government to act on the powers that it already has to protect the fish. And the quality of the water, of course, is a major impact on the fish.
Well, that fills the time more or less, Ms. Malcolmson, but a very interesting position, which I'm sure will generate a lot of discussion and is closely related to the topic of water quality and the role of the Fisheries Act in protecting water quality. Monsieur Bélanger, la parole est à vous.
Mr. Bélanger, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. For over 20 years, the Rivers Foundation has been dedicated to protecting the natural character of rivers, water quality, and shoreline access. We believe in encouraging the multiplication of respectful uses of waterways in order for more people who love rivers so that they can protect them. Here are a few key challenges. Firstly, we need to dispel the false perception that urbanized rivers are intrinsically dirty and polluted. Our rivers are no longer the dumping grounds that they once were, even if there are still major challenges in treating municipal, industrial, and agricultural wastewater, and there's far too many microplastics and emerging contaminants. However, we have to take back these bodies of waters. Secondly, we have to get rid of the false perception that water can be dammed up and channeled and controlled. With climate change, there's too much water in some places and not enough water elsewhere. If we let rivers flow freely but thoughtfully, then we can better adapt to climate change. Here's why I'm mentioning this. We are information mediators. We interpret data with the intention of protecting our water sources and rivers. We use knowledge in order to take action. In order to act, we start by taking stock of the situation in a comprehensive and fair and useful way. That's what we've done on municipal wastewater treatment issues in Quebec. We structured public data provided by various wastewater treatment plants. It's been mentioned that we collect a lot of data, and it's a bit of an illness to do so, but very few people actually analyze it and use it. We have a tool called Audito that allows us to create a map to compare performances from one municipality to another, and it is also a fantastic diagnostic tool. The impact was instantaneous. The media relayed the information, citizens mobilized, and elected representatives asked for change. Audito became a public a tool that was useful for the public, enabling elected officials, citizens, and the minister to do their jobs more effectively. Here's the link with the Canadian Water Agency. The Canadian Water Agency must be a facilitator and allow for the flow of data. This is a very complex business and requiring solutions. It requires solutions that transcend administrative divisions and involve shared jurisdictions. How can we ensure that the agency makes the right contribution to supporting the efforts of the provinces, particularly Quebec? The agency can play a facilitating role, encouraging the cross-fertilization of scientific, public, private, and citizen expertise, as well as Indigenous expertise. The agency can facilitate the creation of simple, powerful, and mobilizing indicators. A good indicator does not have to be perfect, and scientists alone should not be the only ones who have it. It requires that people in the field use it. A good indicator must be used to take action in favor of watercourse protection. That's what our annual ranking did. And various municipalities have become more mobilized through its use. In Gaspésie, a direct link was discovered between the ban on shellfish harvesting and the poor performance of other data. The fisheries department had already done some studies that indicated that there was some pollution. Secondly, the agency must facilitate data sharing. We collect a lot of data across Canada, but for what purpose? What picture does it provide? We should support the sharing of as much data as possible, develop an interoperability mechanism, so open data, and support citizens' efforts to explore seemingly disparate data. Third, we must involve civil society in the search for solutions. Water protection requires active and committed participation from civil society. Citizens' organizations are creative and committed, and they know how to get public authorities moving. You already know that. Innovation will emerge from the grassroots, and the agency must support citizen science and mobilization initiatives. A good example is the Action Climat Québec funding program to support citizen mobilization in the fight against climate change. So playing the role of a facilitator requires the agency to act as a facilitator that brings people together while respecting the jurisdictions of each province. We need this if we are to succeed in collectively protecting our precious water resource. It's very interesting indeed. Thank you very much. I'm sure the questions will be very interesting indeed. On to Mr. Krem for the first turn.
Being here today. I'd like to start with Ms. Malcolmson from the Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition. Ms. Malcolmson, you talked about the targets that you are trying to achieve are further and further out of your grasp in your opening statement. Could you elaborate on what exactly are these targets that you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. The province of Ontario passed the Lake Simcoe Protection Act in 2008 and plan in 2009. I was the lead campaigner for environmental defense to get that legislation with Rescue Lake Simcoe and Ontario Nature. The main problem we have at Lake Simcoe is phosphorus pollution. So we have a target of reducing the phosphorus loads, annual phosphorus loads to the lake, to 44 tons a year, from now about 90 to 100 tons a year. When you compare the two most recent 10-year periods, our phosphorus loads are actually going slightly up. This was 100% anticipated by the previous provincial government, some study that they did at our request as part of multi-stakeholder work to analyze the impacts of growth development on the watershed. So really it's stormwater and urban development that is driving that increase, or the fact that we are not making substantial gains. The only reductions that are known have come from improvements to sewage treatment plants. So thank you very much. I think there was federal funding for that too. But it's limited. Like, we've picked the low-hanging fruit. So reducing phosphorus at this point is increasingly challenging. And I just will note that also appreciate the federal government made a $24 million contribution and really kickstarted getting a phosphorus treatment plant on the Holland River built, and the province is now aiming to get that done in this administration. There are other targets as well. Well, I try to achieve 40% high quality natural cover would be one of those, and that also fits with a 30 by 30 target that the federal government has. We have nowhere near 40% high quality natural cover in the watershed. So that's one of those really important indicators for health, and also, of course, important for climate change. We're making no progress on that.
Okay, so let's come back to phosphorus levels. It was my understanding that the the previous federal Conservative government had a program called the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund, and reducing phosphorus levels was one of the goals of that program. And it's my understanding that during that time, the phosphorus levels were actually going down, and that this was measurable and demonstrable and all the rest. Do you have any views on the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund and the work that was done at that time?
Yeah, thank you. It was really important to have that fund, and mostly it's the Conservation Authority and the Ontario government that used that money. I don't really care which government produces the fund or which government names the fund. I mean, the name of the fund is not important to me. That what's important to the lake and to the people who care about it is the effect. And so again, if you do look at the phosphorus loads comparing to recent decades, they're not going down. And the reason, again, is because we've done not enough to control the pollution. And the pollution is stormwater, and it's overland pollution. I mean, it comes from farming and all sorts of sectors as well, of course, but the growing sector is growth. And so that, again, is why we come back to fighting sprawl in Southern Ontario and in this very delicate watershed. And I think it's important to make the connection between land use and water. I mean, what I really don't want is for the government to say, we'll just keep throwing money at this and it's going to be fine. I'm here to say that's not enough. We appreciate the money, of course. To be clear, my organization has never received federal funding for this kind of work. But we continue to advocate, right, and to talk about the need to control sprawl for so many reasons. So money is great, but we need enforcement of existing policy, and we need teeth.
Okay, well, I like a lot of what you said, where throwing money at a problem is not necessarily the best practice, and how the name of a program is not necessarily what's most important. But in terms of the actual tangible policies, like we've had the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund in the past, we've had various provincial government programs. Can you point to any tangible government initiatives that worked well or maybe did not work so well?
Yes. So what has worked well was throwing money at improving the technologies used at the sewage treatment plants, also throwing money at stormwater management. So stormwater is about 30% of the phosphorus load, and some of you may be aware that it turns out the technology doesn't save us from all of the harms, and that actually some of the methods that we think are going to work end up not working that well in a few decades. And that's the case with stormwater management ponds. Some of them have become a source of phosphorus pollution because of the type of digestion that happens, the anaerobic digestion, and the fact that we have a lot of salt.
Thank you.
We need to manage salt.
Thanks very much. I have to pass it to Mr. Longfield now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'd like to start with Mr. Belanger. I know there's been some experience around the Mercier Lagoon with PCBs and the contamination of groundwater and the plume that's created, which is a real challenge to drinking water. Up in Curl, we've met with the representatives around the leak in the tailings pond, and I recently spoke with Chief Tuckerow from the Miscue Creek Cree Nation about the challenges there, which have naphthenic acid and heavy metals. You mentioned in your testimony about the monitoring and the tools that have been developed to monitor contamination. Could you maybe tell us how those could maybe be modified for areas where maybe naphthenic acid is the concern, or PCBs would be the concern somewhere else? Is this monitoring adaptable to different conditions that we're trying to monitor?
Les outils technologiques.
The tools exist, and they are common. We took interest in the fecal matter, so less with regards less to the pollution that comes from a chemical background. The resources exist. Our challenge is for the data to be accessible quickly and for it to be a driver of decision making. With regards to Mercier, it's pretty desperate as a situation. The lagoons are being cleaned, and they'll do that indefinitely. In Blainville, they're talking about a waste plant being expanded. They claim that the membrane is impermeable, but that probably won't be true in time. We'll find out. There's a communication issue here. The risks need to be understood and communicated, and there needs to be a follow-up that's done appropriately. A lot of data is collected once again, but then we really do need some targeted goals and that allow for prevention.
Tucker also mentioned in terms of real time, where some of his people used to go out on the land and use the snow to make their tea. Now he isn't sure because people are getting sick. Can they use the snow? So having some type of field analysis would be important. Maybe this is the type of thing we could bring through the Canada Water Agency.
Absolument, absolument.
Absolutely. Once a standard or acceptable standard is established for the entire country, then we can decide if those standards are being respected across the country. These standards, of course, have to take into consideration the scientific and environmental reality, not just political questions.
In the experimental lakes area was near and dear to me. I grew up in Winnipeg. I used to canoe in that area where the experimental lakes are. It was closed under the Harper government. We found ways of keeping it open through the province, through Ontario, and then later on the federal government stepped in. I spoke with the chief up in Dryden who talked about the need to start with clean water. The monitoring of that water is very important if there's a paper mill nearby for the Indigenous communities to know whether the water is acceptable or not. Could you comment on whether the experimental lakes has been working with field monitoring and the ability to look at the lakes in real time, or is that an opportunity for the Canada Water Agency?
I think there's a lot of opportunities there. So at the ISD Experimental Lakes area, especially since we've transferred to a nonprofit agency, we have been reaching out to our First Nations partners, and many of them, especially in Treaty 3, are developing their own community-based monitoring programs, and we're facilitating that where we can. I think you're absolutely right that citizens are concerned about their water quality. And is it safe? Is it drinkable? Is it swimmable? And in order for them to know that not only does the monitoring have to be done, but they need access to the data, and they need it in a rapid fashion.
Sioux Lookout and the water training center there, as well as water monitoring center in Sioux Lookout that goes into the Nan Nations in different places, where filtration solutions have been put in place, and then you have a flood event or you have an industrial event. To be able to have open access to data is part of what your testimony was. Could you maybe just confirm some of that? I only have a few seconds left.
Yeah, so one of our concerns is that while there's a lot of data being collected on monitoring from different agencies across the country, that data is not readily accessible to scientists, to the public, to governments. It needs to be more available. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Longfield. Madame Posé.
Oui, alors.
Ms. Posé, thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. I will start with Mr. Bélanger. Thank you for coming in person. You offer a lot of counsel to municipalities. Do you know how many municipalities asked for your services? That's about 25 municipalities right now. Here's what we're developing now. It's an approach according to each watershed. So cooperate between the municipalities that are receiving pollution, for example, and those who are giving it. So there are some municipalities in the north, about 16 are committed now to optimizing the municipal wastewater. You talked about the tool that you use, Audito. Has anybody else in Canada or any other municipalities have they taken interest? The challenge is really comparing data. Quebec is an expert with regards to municipal wastewater data, more so than what is demanded for by the federal government. So our data is more specific. However, we are still unable to compare properly. It would be very great for Quebecers to know that they are where they're situated. You talked about sharing data and how difficult it is. Other witnesses have also talked about it, and they'll talk. I'm sure others will mention it later. Did you use a model that can work with other data collection systems? Yes, we use the government's data. We're not inventing the formatting that already exists in open access format. The tool is there, but we just want to decide what to do with that data. We wanted a pilot project between Quebec and Ottawa and a few municipalities so that we can compare them to one another and then create more data that would allow us to make a comparison across the country. You are really somebody who works on who does field work and groundwork. The federal government is very far from municipalities and from various communities. We always fear that they will interfere with projects that are already on the go because they don't know the local laws, for example. Is that something that is concerning to you as well? When I looked at the briefs that the Canadian Water Agency had produced, or that were produced on the agency, there was a lot of powers that were being given back to the agency, and that was concerning for Quebec. We are not so concerned by that right now. I think the federal government has taken more of a step back, or rather a larger perspective, and therefore they can be a good facilitator without meddling in the actual work. However, calls for tender and so on, and opening funding to these smaller participants would allow for innovation. We shouldn't forget that. We shouldn't rely on institutions that already exist in those specific provinces because they often have their own red tape. Thank you, Mr. Bélanger. I'm going to ask a question to Mr. Higgins now. To access your study, there is a link, but it led to a broken link, as though the page was broken or inaccessible. So I'd like you to send us that link. But the ISD has a plan to improve various measures, such as collecting data. You have federal funding of over $37 million, but there are already 11 government bodies that do research on freshwater. Do they receive a part of that $37 million?
I guess to answer your question is I'm not exactly sure where all of that funding goes. The funding that we receive from the federal government and from the province of Ontario and Manitoba goes to supporting our science infrastructure. And then we obtain funding for science through with our partners, our academic partners and government partners through other funding programs.
Vous comprendrez que quand on questionne le
You'll understand that when we look into the government's finances, we'd like for it to be as transparent as possible, especially lately. So I'm looking at your work, the data collection and so on. Aren't you sort of a Canadian water agency? That's a great question, but we will have to wait for the answer. But it's a good question. Mr. Blakey.
Minutes, please.
Sure. Well, maybe along a similar line to Mr. Higgins, I'm curious to know, with the government looking to set up a new Canada Water Agency, what do you think are some of the potential pitfalls in setting up a new agency like that government should be seeking to avoid? And what do you think are some of the best practices that they should be looking to so as not to simply duplicate work, but actually add value to what's already out there?
Right. That's a really good question. I think there are a number of players in the water sector across Canada because it integrates into almost every sector in Canada and affects almost every person in Canada. I think if you're going to say on the pitfall side, I think the concern would be issues around red tape and accessibility. And I think on the benefit side, I think what we're really missing in the national context is what we recommended is this national water strategy, because we really don't understand issues around water quality or water quantity at a national scale. And there are some big issues and risks that Canada and Canadians face. A recent study in the United States indicated that PFAS chemicals, these forever chemicals, that are carcinogenic and have all sorts of human health issues are widespread across the United States and previously unknown. And if someone was going to ask me that question and say, well, what's the status in Canada? I would say we don't know because we have no system right now that evaluates these sort of risks at a national scale.
Would you say are some of this, like either not necessarily specific organizations, although if you want to volunteer those, that's fine. But what would you say are the sectors that need to be around the table and the government needs to be listening to as they set up the Canada Water Agency to make sure that all of the folks who do already have a hand in collecting data or actively managing fresh water in Canada are heard at the outset and that we maximize the potential of the water agency?
Yeah, I think the Canada Water Agency has an uphill battle here because, as I said, the water affects almost every sector in Canada and is very important. So this goes from many of the federal departments where water is critical in their mandates. There's also the provincial governments have responsibility. This goes right down to the watershed level and watershed groups that monitor and measure water quality or water quantity. And then there's industry and our partners in agriculture. I mean, it really goes on and on. There are a lot of individuals across Canada and organizations that this affects.
So is there some thinking about how to try and organize those voices in the setting up of the water agency to have the agency be able to accept the advice and the input of those various sectors in a good way and be able to bring that together? Are there models that you've seen elsewhere that you think do a good job of incorporating that kind of multi-sectoral feedback?
Yeah, I think there are models. There's in the United States, for example, they have national monitoring programs that identify the risks that have come from different sectors and can respond to those risks. Across Canada, you can imagine there are large risks related to water quantity. Between climate change and increased rainfall and flooding in parts of the country and increased risks of droughts in other parts of the country, water quantity is going to be a critical aspect of what the Canada Water Agency should do. And, I really think its role really needs to be to bring together these disparate groups in order to really target issues that are of national importance. There are already many groups working on water across Canada. This work doesn't need to be duplicated. but it needs to be strengthened, and we need a national picture.
So one of the groups that I'm most familiar with is the Red River Basin Commission, in part because my office actually is in a building with theirs. Clearly, there's a lot of water work that crosses international boundaries with our partners in the United States. What role, if any, do you think a new Canada Water Agency should have in addressing those kind of transboundary questions, and to what extent should its work involve that international work, or should that be left to the organizations that are already doing it? What's your kind of vision for the new water agency in respect of those international questions?
Well, that's a great question because it's a transboundary water. The International Joint Commission is involved, and there is a federal role here, very clear federal role that has already been accepted. I think the Canada Water Agency can play a role, and this is one of those issues where watersheds can be really big and cross provincial borders, like this does as well. The Lake Winnipeg, which has massive algal blooms, receives water from Ontario, it receives water from Saskatchewan and Alberta, and it receives water from several U.S. states, and it's incredibly challenging. Now, a lot of efforts have been placed on reducing phosphorus loads from point sources, like sewage treatment plants, but most of the phosphorus is now coming from non-point sources in this watershed.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We are starting the second turn, and it is on to Mr. Deltel for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, colleagues. Welcome to our witnesses to the Parliament of Canada. Mr. Bélanger, I'll start with you. We've met you before. It's a pleasure to meet you, as we all know you and your organization. Your know-how is, of course, deserves to be more notorious. Can you tell us more about Audito and how it works, and what are the results that you've yielded? With examples, please. A simple example. The mayor of Louisville said in the media that the purification plants are very bad. And so we looked at the graphics, and it allowed us to identify an unknown source of contamination. We realized that in March every year there were peaks, and something was entering the sewers. That was quite unusual because it usually doesn't happen that much, and it was an industrial source. By discussing with the environment minister, we were able to confirm their suspicions. That was a smart way of using that data. That's what we did with Audito. We also do follow-ups for water quality in real time. This helps municipalities to open up spaces for swimming. Why? Because that allows us to demystify the river, and that pollution varies in time, and that's normal. Have you able to given shoreline access back to some citizens? In Assomption, we have been able to. The river was renamed Aswomption because people, the water was brown. In Châteauguay, it was proven that the water is safe for swimming. This, of course, is good for tourism and allows for tourism that is respectful of the environment. We're also working in Richelieu and various other northern municipalities that are banding together on this topic. Have you noticed something about the quality of the pollution? Is it chemical industrial pollution, or is it because of the way we use water and it's uncontrolled? Well, with regards to swimming, it's in the summer, and that's from the municipality. But in the spring, it's agriculture. Phosphorus and nitrogen are culprits. There still isn't a clear strategy, though, and 30% of the nitrogen comes from the Great Lakes. We have to ensure that the rules and regulations with regards to the watershed are implemented more soundly. Last week, there were scientists who were working on a pilot project of how we should treat water that is impacted by salt used to de-ice the roads. And there was a project that was accepted in Assomption. I was wondering if you have seen a variation over the course of the past years. You talked about some contaminants in our rivers. Do you feel that in some suburbs or in urban areas that salt has an impact on the water quality? And of course it does. Here's what the challenge is. Ms. Malcolmson mentioned it earlier. It's urban sprawl. Mineralization of soil is also an issue. We don't focus enough on that. Protecting rivers has to do with managing the soil. We just wrote to Northvolt and to their CEO to remind them that they're going to be adding minerals to a zone that actually absorbs minerals from water, and they have a certain responsibility in protecting the water there. I think that will be the Achilles heel, or that is an Achilles heel, rather, with regards to decision-making for governments. You had a very interesting graphic that you provided. You talked about citizen efforts. Is there anything that you can give to us? Very briefly, there's a principle that is called freedom of space. There's a lot of citizens mobilizing in order to allow for changes to adapt to climate change.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to direct my questions to the Executive Director of Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition. Ms. Malcolmson, thank you for being here today and highlighting the challenges we face with Lake Simcoe and the pollution, the loading on the lake. You started by mentioning the Chippewas of Georgina Island. There are other First Nations, Rama First Nation, Beausoleil as well. And it was not too long ago that the First Nations under the Williams Treaty actually got the rights to harvest fish back. And looking at the levels of pollution, not only that exist, but the new contaminants, the PFAS and other contaminants that we are finding now, it would seem that newly found right could be very difficult to exercise if the fish were in fact contaminated. And I was interested that when you talked about the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, you mentioned that they weren't going to do a review unless asked to do a review on the health of fish. And I was wondering, who were they waiting to be asked by? Because I think you have asked repeatedly for that review. So who needs to ask? Is it the province that has to ask?
Thank you, Ms. Taylor-Roy, for the question. MP Taylor-Roy. So it's under the Ministry of Transportation of Ontario. They exempted themselves from doing a typical environmental assessment. It is a streamlined, self-approved environmental assessment. So they're really behaving like it's already approved, and all they really need is to mitigate. And I'm just really here to assert that if we're going to save the water and the things that live in the water, like the bait fish or the fish, we have to actually investigate. And this is an example, like I have now reviewed all the information. There are a lot of holes. So the information we have that says that the project proponent, in this case the Ministry of Transportation of Ontario, would request a review. That was from actually a petition. We did a formal petition to Jerry DeMarco's office, and at the time Joyce Murray was the minister of the DFO, and her response indicated that they were waiting to be asked. So I've never participated in an environmental assessment before, let alone a very unique one, streamlined, self-approved one. So I'm not really sure what the typical process is, but we will as indicated in my letter, I just sent this letter to the project team in Ontario for the Bradford bypass, and I got a response right away. They're not even monitoring the email anymore. So I have to wrap this all up for a package for the DFO. I wanted the project team to respond to these concerns, but they're not even monitoring our email. Just as an example of guardrails being gone in Ontario. So, I mean, I guess I don't think it's really appropriate that the project proponent would have to ask for a review. I think it should, and maybe that's a question that you could answer for me too, is it not appropriate for the DFO to request a review? And that's what our letter to the DFO will say, that we think, given all the evidence that I'm giving you about how many holes there are in this information and the multiple layers of federal jurisdiction that could be affected by this work, that you should request a review.
Right. Thank you. Yes, because it seems under DFO and also in our jurisdiction is Indigenous rights, although we're transferring that, and hopefully they will have more rights to directly ask the Government of Ontario about what's happening. But with the Ministry of Transportation, so the Government of Ontario basically exempted the entire project from an environmental assessment, and then the Ministry of Transportation is saying they're not going to request any kind of review from DFO as well. So it's sorry, go ahead.
The way that they word it is the consultant team. It's AECOM working for the MTO, so they've been hired by the MTO to write these reports, right? So that they will determine if they think a review is needed. Then they will ask for it. Well, I'm just here to sound an alarm. It's not appropriate.
Yeah. Well, this sounds like perhaps something the Canada Water Agency can do in terms of collaborating, having the federal and provincial levels collaborate. You know, I was reflecting on what you were saying about the phosphorus levels, and the phosphorus levels have gone down over time, but they're still very close to, they're not gone down enough, and they're going to increase obviously with more development. But it seems a little bit like, medication that rather than addressing the underlying cause, you try and treat the symptom only to see their side effects, and that, in fact, the problem is going to persist. And so I think this issue of how, the federal government can work with provincial governments is very important, and thank you for bringing that up.
Merci, Mme Posé, 2 minutes et demie.
Thank you. On to Ms. Posey for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to remind Mr. Higgins that I would very much like to have access to the study on the fossil fuel spillage. Please don't forget. I'll have another question for you later, Mr. Higgins, but I do have a last question for Mr. Bélanger first. Can you explain how you intervene among other participants who manage water in Quebec? We're lucky because we are not institutionalized. We work with watershed organizations. We are sort of the bad cop and they are the good cops. So we work closely with them on certain issues. We will speak publicly and call things out in order to make sure that things can make progress later. So it's sort of as though we're acupuncturists who make sure that there's a certain flow. In Assomption, there is a mobilization organization that I'm sure that you've worked with. And indeed, now one can swim in the water. Mr. Higgins, you mentioned the data stream tool. Can you tell us what information the Institute provides for this tool, which seems very promising? What is your link to this this tool of data stream?
Okay, thank you for that question. So my organization has its own open database as well that we freely share our data with anyone and everyone. And we've collected that data for over 50 years. Now, we're also in the watershed of Lake Winnipeg. And so we share our flow data and the water chemistry data from our streams, from our monitoring program. And we share that routinely now to the portal, to the data stream portal.
J'aurais peut-être une dernière question.
One last question, perhaps Mr. Bélanger or even Mr. Higgins can answer. It's about the agency. You are two witnesses that provided different mandates to the agency. This happens at every panel. But we don't know anything yet. We don't have any particular mission. What do you think of that, Mr. Bélanger? Very quickly, because then we'll have to go on to Mr. Blakey. It's clear that the mandate has to be about data. That's what brings people together the most, the ability to give good data and to have a perspective that is on Canada but also abroad. Mr. Blakey.
Back to you. When it comes to kind of community-led data collection on freshwater, the program I'm most familiar with is the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network. And I'm wondering if you think that we have a kind of adequate amount of those kinds of programs across the country, or if you think one of the roles of the new Canada Water Agency would be to try and foster more of that activity and to enhance it where it already exists. And finally, and I'll hand it over to you, I'm curious, my colleague Laurel Collins has talked a lot about the idea of having a youth climate corps to guarantee employment for young folks and to help combat the climate crisis. Do you think that these kind of community-led data gathering exercises would be something that could benefit from the employment of something like a youth climate corps?
So that's a great question. There are a lot of community-based organizations and citizen science groups in Canada. An example might be the Lake Partners program in Ontario, where citizens have been going out and measuring water quality in their lakes for now decades. But this said, there are real gaps across the country, and organizations like this need to be supported. They're very efficient at what they do in terms of cost efficiency and their ability to reach a wide number of lakes. It's just a really good way to do it. I'll say one of my first jobs out of high school was with an environmental youth corps in Ontario, and it was a great experience. I think it's great to provide training to young people, but at the same time, I absolutely agree with you that these youth can be harnessed to help collect this sort of monitoring data.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Blakey. Mr. Mason.
Chair?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for coming out here today. Mr. Higgins, we've heard about the devastating impact that raw sewage dumping has on Canadian waterways. IASD released information on how untreated sewage contributes to harmful algae blooms. Can you discuss the harmful impact that sewage in water has and share recommendations on how to address this issue?
Right. So we've been doing work on algal blooms at the Experimental Lakes area for over 50 years. And it started back when it was a federal institution. And that's why the Experimental Lakes area was actually started, was to deal with the algal bloom issues in the Laurentian Great Lakes. And now they're very pervasive. It's one of the biggest issues and the most ubiquitous issues around the world for freshwater. Phosphorus, our position is that phosphorus is really the key element we need to target. And it comes from more than one source, point sources and non-point sources, and treated and untreated. And it depends on where you are, which is most important. But this is exactly in the area. So when we encounter a problem, let's say it's like Winnipeg or elsewhere, we would say, first, let's target and find out exactly where this phosphorus is coming from so we can efficiently and effectively deal with the problem. In the Lake Winnipeg watershed, for example, only 6% to 9% of the phosphorus is coming from wastewater treatment plants in Winnipeg. The vast majority is coming from non-point sources. So in those circumstances, we say, hey, focus the effort here on non-point sources. We need to deal with that problem. In other areas, it's raw sewage or treated sewage.
Okay, so I guess I'll follow up with that just to point out Winnipeg's, and this is from your study, actually, and can you table any or forward to the committee as far as what studies have been done and then follow up over the years, like where are we at for dumping raw sewage, even outside of Manitoba, like across Canada? Because I do want to point out, if you could do that, And then Winnipeg's North End, and this is from your website, North End Water Pollution Control Center is the single largest point source of phosphorus flowing into Lake Winnipeg and the fourth largest phosphorus polluter among all wastewater treatment facilities in Canada. So I don't quite understand why you're going after all the rest of the Assiniboine River Basin and the Red River Basin on non-point sources when you've got one big nest of pollution sitting right there that could be addressed very succinctly.
Well, I absolutely agree with you, actually, that we need to target the point sources. And in fact, the city of Winnipeg's wastewater treatment plants have not been meeting their phosphorus discharge targets for a very long time, and they need to. And so that absolutely needs to be addressed. I guess what I'm arguing is saying that if we address those, it's still not going to be enough because 60, 70% of the phosphorus that flows into Lake Winnipeg is coming from non-point sources as well. So we really, if we want to address the problem, we also need to deal with those issues.
Yeah, and
I totally agree that we need to deal with the point sources.
Again, I think, and I'm being a lifelong farmer and living out on the landscape, I live farm out by the Brandon area, actually, upstream of Winnipeg. But all that, you're talking about, 2 prairie provinces and a Red River Basin as well, and into the United States. I do honestly think that is maybe a place where we can really focus on and get some real wins and then start going forward on that instead of blaming agriculture for doing what they do. Anyways, do you have any recommendations on effluent regulations? Like where do you think we should go with this? Like if we're going to tackle this effluent regulations, is there a way, like should we focus more maybe on the cities or what should we do?
Well, I think we need to deal with wastewater treatment plants that discharge into receiving waters especially where there are issues like Lake Winnipeg and algal bloom issues. Those would be the target places that we'd want to deal with the fastest. I think our position is that, there's discussion at the policy level, depending on where you are in the country or in the United States on whether we treat nitrogen or not to deal with this eutrophication or algal bloom issue. Our position is that it's very costly to deal with nitrogen, and we are unconvinced that would actually solve the problem. Our position is we really need to focus our resources on dealing with phosphorus.
Thank you.
From wastewater and other sources.
Mr. Ali, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here today and sharing your knowledge and experience with us. During its meetings in early February, the committee heard concerns from several witnesses about a couple of human resources shortages. One witness said that hydrogeology graduates program had trouble finding Canadian graduate students to take advantage of the available research funding opportunities. Several other witnesses informed the committee that there are not enough certified water technicians to meet residential consumer demand. So I have 2 questions arising from that testimony. One, what could the federal government be doing differently to attract Canadians to freshwater fields of study and to keep specialists, both Canadians and international, in Canada? And the second question, are Canadian federal freshwater research facilities and funding opportunities sufficient to retain academics and to attract high caliber graduate students? I will start with Mr. Higgins, please.
Okay, so that's a really good question about what we would typically refer to as highly qualified personnel and their training. So, I'll say very personally from the Experimental Lakes area example is that, in addition to the research and monitoring that we do, we have a large number of undergraduate and graduate students and even high school students now that come to our facility to we offer them employment for the summer, but through that employment they gain a lot of expertise, and they go on into other jobs in government, in consultancies, in industry, and others. We have benefited greatly from a number of federal funding programs that help fund hiring students by organizations, specifically into environmental fields. So I think that could be a real benefit. Another thing that we have found very helpful is a number of universities have cooperative education programs where students can not only do their academic training, but receive sort of on-the-ground training within industry or partners like ourselves in the water sector. And this really benefits them so that when they finish their undergraduate degrees, they have experience in the sector, and they can more easily find jobs in the sector.
Thank you. Ms. Malcolmson, do you want to add something to it, please?
Sure. I think, I'm not a water researcher person, so I don't have a whole lot to add to this. I think it's what I'm finding, actually, to be honest, I'm trying to find some people who will provide a second opinion about the impacts to water of the Bradford bypass. I'll keep talking about that. And it's really, really challenging because people don't want to speak out against the government. And so I think I come back to, the government of Ontario and the government of Canada really need to use the tools that they have, because in particular where you've got people who, the affordability crisis in Canada is pretty huge. People, not a lot of people can sort of risk their future by sticking their neck out to actually protect a water body. So the kind of thing that I do is really rare. There aren't a lot of folks that are taking this kind of risk. So yes, please support the scientists, but also please do the work so that you don't ask people to put their careers at risk by providing a second opinion about controversial information.
Thank you. Dr. Higgins, it's been 9 years since the International Institute for Sustainable Development took on the management of the experimental lake area. There's some work being done there on the impact of climate change on the lakes. Could you please elaborate on that aspect of the research being done?
Unfortunately,
Sure.
we're sort of out of time. Would you be able to send us a short note about this to the committee, and we'll be able to incorporate it in our evidence?
Yes.
I just want to thank the panel for.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Those 5 minutes were pretty fast.
When you're in an interesting discussion, it does go fast. But it was a very interesting discussion, and you opened up some new perspectives that I think we hadn't really seen so far in the study. So thank you to all the witnesses. We're going to break for about 5 minutes to onboard the witnesses for the second panel. So thank you again. Thank you very much. All the names out, just in the interest of time. I'll read them as the witness comes up for their 5-minute remarks. We'll start with data stream. We have Aislinn Livingstone, the program manager, with us here in person. So, Ms. Livingstone, go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you to the committee for inviting us. My name is Aislinn Livingstone, and I'm honored to be here today representing DataStream in my capacity as Water Program Manager. The focus of our testimony today is data. Canada-wide, we have a major problem around access to water data, and this is affecting our ability to make evidence-based decisions. At DataStream, we've come to know this challenge intimately through our own work, trying to track down water data across the country. DataStream is a charity dedicated to advancing freshwater protection through open data and the inclusion of public voices in decision-making, and we've been working in this area for about 10 years. In that time, DataStream has dramatically improved the availability of water quality data in Canada. We've done this through our comprehensive programming, which includes an online data sharing platform. Over 260 organizations are using DataStream to share almost 40 million data points collected at monitoring locations from coast to coast to coast. We work with community groups, governments, Indigenous nations, and academics who are sharing data so that it can be put to use for freshwater protection. It's great to see that 3 monitoring organizations that we have collaborated closely with are also appearing as witnesses today. While we've made major progress, there's still significant work ahead, and much of this needs to be led by government agencies. The recommendations I'm sharing today focus on 3 areas where we can make progress in addressing Canada's data access issue: working with community-based groups, making data openly accessible, and improving coordination. These recommendations draw on our 10 years of experience working to improve access to data in Canada. So I'll start with community. Communities are an essential part of Canada's ability to adapt to freshwater issues and climate change. DataStream alone works with more than 150 community organizations, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, that are out on their waters, monitoring and responding to environmental changes as they happen. In Atlantic Canada, where I live, we work with more than 70 watershed groups that are tackling issues like endangered salmon habitat, pesticides from agricultural runoff, and contamination from gold mining, among many others. There's also an incredible example right here in Ottawa. Over the last 20 years, Ottawa Riverkeeper, who you'll hear from later, has made major headway, and they are applying the data that they collect to finding issues to solutions ranging from road salts to sewage overflows. To realize the full potential of these on-the-ground initiatives and ensure that communities are meaningfully engaged in water decisions, a unified federal approach to community-based monitoring is needed, including resources, investment, and cross-sector partnership building. We recommend that the federal government use data collected by communities for informed decision-making, including climate change adaptation, and provide long-term funding support for community-led monitoring and restoration. I'll move on to open data. Water data needs to be open by default so that policies and decisions are based on the best available evidence. Progress has been made to improve access to federally collected data, but more work is needed. From 2019 to 2020 alone, the Government of Canada invested over $73 million in water-related research. However, the data from this kind of research isn't always shared publicly. Ensuring that this data is openly accessible would maximize these investments by facilitating broader data reuse. To share another example, despite extensive water monitoring and research, in the 2020 Global Data Drive for Sustainable Development Goal 6.3.2, which tracks the health of ambient water quality, Canada reported on the status of rivers, but has not reported on groundwater or open water bodies, such as lakes and reservoirs. We know that a freshwater data strategy is being developed by the Canada Water Agency, and we're optimistic that it will achieve an integrated, coordinated, and standardized approach to freshwater data, and this should include both surface water and groundwater. To achieve this, we recommend that the federal government first fully implement existing open by data policies so that all data collected using public funds are also publicly available, harmonize data across departments, programs, and jurisdictions by adopting universal data standards, and invest in sustainable, scalable data systems so that Canada's freshwater data strategy is built to last. And finally, on coordination. We consistently hear that it's really hard to figure out who's doing what when it comes to water in Canada. For example, over 20 federal departments have responsibilities related to water. And while there's a reason for this complexity, since water is involved in everything from human health to industry, monitoring groups we work with want to help find solutions, but they're not always sure who to talk to. In our work, we've seen that water data is managed totally differently from one jurisdiction to the next. Better cooperation will allow communities and governments to invest more efficiently in monitoring and respond more quickly to freshwater issues. Ultimately, this will build trust in the institutions that are responsible for water. Now is a great time to improve transparency and coordination of surface water and groundwater activities in Canada. We recommend that the Canada Water Agency provide a water concierge service to actively connect people to the appropriate decision-making bodies, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So in closing, thank you again to this committee for the opportunity to share our views with you for your study of freshwater in Canada.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Living Lakes Canada. We have Kat Hartwig, Georgia Peck, and Paige Thurston, all on video conference. I imagine, Ms. Hartwig, you will be presenting for the 5-minute introductory remarks?
Yes, I will. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Kat Hartwig. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Living Lakes Canada. I've worked in the NGO environmental sector for 33 years, and the last 20 focused on freshwater stewardship. I live in Briscoe, BC, which is the traditional territory of the Ktunaxa and the Secwepemc Nations. Living Lakes Canada programs include education, research, monitoring, data collection, restoration, and policy development for the long-term protection of lakes, rivers, wetlands, aquifers, and watersheds in Canada. We work to help people address the impacts of climate change on water quality and quantity and biodiversity in their respective communities. Joining us today are my colleagues Paige Thurston, manager of our Columbia Basin Hydrometric and Groundwater Program, and Georgia Peck, manager of our lake monitoring programs across Canada, and they are here to help answer your questions. We will provide you with 3 recommendations for your freshwater study based on our experience from the last 2 decades working in freshwater research, monitoring, and data. Our work originates in the Canadian Columbia Basin, which lies between 2 mountain ranges, the Rockies and the Purcells. This area is considered to be the water towers of our food-growing belts in southeastern BC, the Prairie Provinces, and parts of the U.S. We are currently experiencing extreme drought conditions from last year with no expected relief and likely worsening conditions this year. The cycle of drought, forest fires, and flooding has become our new norm. Recommendations for the freshwater study are as follows. Recommendation 1, include the Canadian Columbia Basin, a watershed of national significance, in the Freshwater Action Plan with designated funding via the Canada Water Agency or other funding mechanisms that will support the monitoring and data collection needed to inform water allocation and community adaptation options. Recommendation 2, that any coordinated water and climate monitoring networks being implemented in other river basins are built upon existing successful regional efforts such as the Columbia Basin Water Monitoring Framework and Open Source Data Hub or other templates. It is more cost-effective and faster to replicate best practices of successful and tested methodologies from one region to another. Recommendation 3, advance Indigenous knowledge and data sovereignty through water stewardship. Supporting Indigenous initiatives for water stewardship, then de facto land stewardship, provides us all the opportunity to learn how applied reconciliation can help us shift into new paradigms that provide action and care for many generations to come. In closing, I'm going to reiterate what you already know, that the Canadian Climate Institute issued a report in 2022 stating that by 2025, over 90% climate impacts and disasters will involve water and will slow down Canada's economic growth by $25 billion annually. We commend the efforts for this freshwater study. We also urge you to rapidly accelerate nonpartisan efforts towards water and food security for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people living in our amazing country. In doing so, you have the opportunity to become international leaders in freshwater stewardship. Thank you for your efforts in these very challenging times.
Thank you very much. We'll go to the Manitoba Forage and Grassland Association. We have Duncan Morrison, Executive Director, and Stephen Frey, Director of Research. I assume, Mr. Morrison, you'll be delivering the statement.
Mr. Chair, we're going to give a hybrid presentation. I'm going to
That's
give
fine.
a quick
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Thank you for inviting us to be here. We're extremely grateful. As a farmer-led nonprofit organization with more than 30 years history, Manitoba Forage Grassland Association is extremely sensitive to the needs of those farmers who rely on the land for their livelihood. MFGA staunchly believes that many farmers are doing outstanding work on their farms right now from a soil health, water, healthy ecosystem perspective, and by working with Aquanti, we hope to support that. Our MFGA rationale is simple yet vitally important. When you don't have water, you have problems on your farm, and that's every single farm. The flow of water is the key to understanding agricultural prosperity and the incredible potential that farms and farmers can contribute to society. We'd really appreciate your support. Stephen Fry.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and other members of the committee. Thank you for the privilege of participating here today. Land management in our agricultural regions governs hydrologic response to extreme weather and will play a critical role in ensuring Canadian agriculture and ecosystem sustainability under a changing climate. Beneficial management practices that incorporate wetlands, grasslands, cover crops, minimum tillage, and controlled drainage all promote surface water and groundwater availability, improve water quality, and resiliency to flood, drought, and disease stress. As climate change continues to impact surface water, groundwater is becoming increasingly important to agriculture and ecosystem productivity. Yet initiatives currently proposed to address water resources in Canada ignore groundwater. To underscore the importance of groundwater in many rural areas and First Nation lands, it is often the sole source of water for both people and livestock. In the face of increasing hydrologic uncertainty, tools that extend traditional weather forecasts into water resource forecasts will become critical. Hydrologic forecasting is already commonplace in the water resources management community. However, the most common forecasting tools focus on river flow and overlook the dynamic link between groundwater and surface water. Without groundwater, we are not well suited to look at agricultural drought endpoints. An example of an agriculture-focused hydrologic prediction system that does include groundwater exists in southern Manitoba, where Manitoba Foraging Grassland Association's Water Forecast Portal now generates field-scale weekly and monthly forward-looking hydrologic projections. It is equally important to enhance our ability to project hydrologic conditions farther out into the future and over much larger areas. And this is the objective of the relatively new Canada One Water Initiative. Canada One Water is a collaborative government, interdepartmental, industry, and academic-driven project led by the Geological Survey of Canada and Aquanti, and has developed for the first time ever a national-scale hydrologic modeling framework with open data to project climate change impacts on the surface water and groundwater inventory over the entirety of Canada. Even though a better understanding of short-term and long-term impacts to water resources is vital to Canada's economic and societal sustainability, projects like those mentioned are challenging to launch and perhaps even more challenging to sustain. The MFGA Water Portal was funded by a now discontinued agricultural risk management program, and its current funding for these tools is difficult to obtain. Canada One Water was launched with a considerable investment in time and expertise from the Geological Survey of Canada's Groundwater Geoscience Program and $1 million in funding over 3 years from the Canadian Safety and Security Program, a source of seed money but not sustained funding. Here we're not talking about the need for tens of millions of dollars per year, but rather budgets on the order of a few $1 million per year and a commitment of government lab resources to help deliver world-class hydrologic insights that meet the needs of a broad range of stakeholders. In closing, if I could make 3 recommendations for the committee to consider, they would be to 1, support the development of programs that provide economic return to producers who adopt land management practices that promote hydrologic resiliency. 2, recognize that decision support tools focused on water resources will become increasingly important to our agricultural community, and Canadian technology is leading the way both in Canada and around the world. 3, look into the Canada One Water project and help it find sustained funding to support the valuable initiative. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Et là, maintenant, on passe à Madame.
Thank you very much. Now, on to Ms. Larissa Holman from the Ottawa Riverkeeper.
And thank you for embarking on a comprehensive study of the role of the federal government in protecting and managing Canada's freshwater resources. In your collective role as the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development, you have an opportunity to weigh the various responsibilities for freshwater protection and management throughout Canada. Dans le rôle que je tiens à Garde-Rivière-des-Outaouais,
in my role at Ottawa Riverkeeper, I have seen the challenges and benefits of working across jurisdictions at a watershed scale.
To share some of these experiences with you today here on the unceded, unsurrendered Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. Ottawa Riverkeeper is a charitable organization founded in 2001, and we are a champion for swimmable, drinkable, fishable waters throughout the Ottawa River watershed. Our mission is to protect, promote, and improve ecological health of the largest tributary of the St. Lawrence River, the formidable Ottawa River and its tributaries. En 23 ans, Garde Rivière des
Over 23 years, Ottawa Riverkeeper has grown to become a trusted independent voice for the protection of freshwater within the Ottawa River watershed.
We are a fully bilingual organization, and we use science-based decision-making to inform how and what we advocate for to protect the ecological health of the river, a river upon which so many of us depend. Chances are you are drinking tap water sourced from the Ottawa River today, and yet the health of this river is threatened. As we have been told, pollution has no boundaries. Ottawa Riverkeeper has championed a multitude of issues afflicting our water, from microplastic to radioactive waste, forever chemicals to sewer overflows, and invasive species to endangered species. We Canadians are polluting our waterways. You have an opportunity to fix this. For Ottawa Riverkeeper, these examples highlight the importance of data collection throughout the watershed, and that data be shared and analyzed at a watershed scale, regardless of which province it is obtained from. Ottawa Riverkeeper will soon be releasing its first watershed report card, which benefited from a number of community-based monitoring programs and community scientists to help fill existing data gaps. We also analyze publicly available data across the watershed. This report card provides a comprehensive look at the threats to the watershed at a watershed scale. We look forward to Canada Water Agency taking on an important leadership role in Canada to proactively address national and regional transboundary freshwater challenges and opportunities. As we are fond of saying, you cannot protect half a river. We would also like to highlight the value that watershed organizations like Ottawa Riverkeeper and like those presenting here today can have when trying to address these challenges, as not only do many watershed organizations have a deep understanding of the issues affecting their regions, they often have networks who can provide localized data using a variety of cost-effective techniques. However, to remain effective, watershed organizations require long-term, consistent funding to operate. Ottawa Riverkeeper has also submitted comments on a number of pollution issues, including reviewing the scope of the risk management for per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, also known as PFAS, and the development of a non-fuel radioactive waste management and decommissioning policy. We look to you, members of this committee, to ensure that freshwater will be considered in a more holistic way throughout the development of national policies, not just as an afterthought once these policies have already been drafted. The protection required for freshwater needs to be front and center of national policies as well as global agreements. Thank you for your time and your interest.
Terrific. Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Mazier for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for coming out here today. Mr. Morrison, I'll start with you. How do we ensure that the water policy is developed from the ground up with farmers and landowners and not from top down from Ottawa?
Well, that's a really good question, and certainly one that we're constantly dealing with with our farmers. One thing that we do need is we need some data. We need on-farm research. We need a little bit more support to show the great work that farmers are doing, and to really build that grass up type knowledge around some of the land use and some of the practices that are being used, for sure, and then feed them into a model like the ENVI model, which is absolutely powerful.
Great. So that's a nice segue into Mr. Fry. I've got to have a question for you. So your model in Quanti, I was fortunate enough to be involved with you guys, I guess back in 2011 when we discovered in Manitoba that we had no data. And the flood of 2011 basically did a lot of damage, and thankfully we were still talking about getting data, and things revved up in 2014 when another flood hit. But having said all that, I was very impressed with what Quanti has, how far it's come, and I understand now that Manitoba Forage and Grasslands have taken that over as well. But Mr. Fry, I wonder if you can describe how Quanti works. How is that model, how your model actually works, and why is it so different than anything else that's been kind of proposed in Canada?
So when we model the hydrologic system, we start in the groundwater system and work our way up. So our approach is to look at groundwater and surface water in a holistic manner, fully coupled. And across Canada, groundwater makes up anywhere from 30 to 100% of the water you see in rivers. A lot of the research effort and modeling efforts have really thus far focused only on surface water. It's the water we see. But in times of drought, the water that flows in the rivers is groundwater that's discharging, and that supports ecosystems, it supports wastewater assimilation, it supports irrigation demands, it supports municipal drinking water supplies. So we start from the bottom up, look at the aquifers, look at the aquitards, the groundwater flow systems, and then we layer the land surface on top. And that takes tremendous amounts of data. We have to characterize the subsurface digitally. And those data sets are not readily available. It's one of the big missing links in Canada. How do we characterize the subsurface so we can incorporate it into models? And we work very closely with the Geological Survey of Canada. They're one of the few federal organizations that are actually looking at the groundwater system. It fits into, I think, what they do in terms of skill sets and expertise, because when we talk groundwater, we're talking hydrogeology. That's the world of earth system science, and it ties into mineral exploration, geophysics, remote sensing. So a lot of the elements of building our models takes data sets constructed by federal departments, including Geological Survey, Ag Canada, Canadian Space Agency, Environment Canada. Like, we just consume data from all these different agencies, not from a single source, but wherever we can source it.
You mentioned about groundwater, and I agree with you totally. Like, we often focus on the flooded basement or the houses underwater, but groundwater, you have to consider at least like the other half of what's going on with the water. And so on the data collection, and right now we're talking, like, I guess ECCC is really looking at this water agency and everything all water, right? Do you think that's the best approach, or is there something else we can do here to maybe have a second ask or a second look at how do we coordinate all this data and what agencies that are out there right now that would be almost better suited, or at least be consulted before we make a water plan in Canada?
Yeah, that's a good question, and critically, groundwater has to be considered. I haven't seen a lot of groundwater language within the mandate of the Canadian Water Agency. That may be a limiting factor. I would recommend groundwater takes kind of a role in the front seat of that conversation. And it's going to be impossible to duplicate the expertise within all the different government agencies that steward the data that goes into characterizing Canada's water resources and the physical system with which water flows. So I think all the government agencies that deal with these data sets need to have a seat at the table, and their expertise can't be pulled out of that agency and rejuvenated in a new agency. I think all those different federal departments do have to work together, and it's not just one or two. It goes all the way from the space agency to deep into the groundwater flow system at the Geological Survey of Canada. So
use the resources that we have already, but make sure they're coordinated more than anything.
Absolutely, okay. And don't try and duplicate them.
Okay. And then, of course, I guess I'm wondering about the United States, and they have a national water model. Is there anything Canada could learn from the United States on their modeling, and maybe something that could go into this study as far as their framework and how does it work in the United States to Canada here?
In 20 seconds, please. Yeah.
So the national water model, that's a federal initiative in the U.S., but it's actually, I think, to a certain extent, a private-public partnership, and a lot of the technology is being executed by entities in the private sector. And they, like Linker Technologies, for instance, has a large role to play within the U.S. national water model, and I think they do that for efficiency and potentially cost savings.
Thank you. Madame Chatel.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have questions for Ms. Holman and Mr. Frey. I'll start with Ms. Holman. First of all, thank you very much for being here. And actually, because Ottawa Riverkeeper is an organization that is absolutely essential for the Ottawa River for its protection. You are really the voice of our communities. So thank you for the excellent work that you've been doing since 2001. I'll get into a bit of a more spiny subject now. We talked about Chalk River quite a bit in this committee. Yes, indeed, Ms. Posey knew that I was going to mention that. This is something that we don't talk about enough. And I talked about Ms. Posey about it. There is radioactive waste that is there. You know, we keep delaying the management of that waste, and that really makes me so anxious. You clearly stated in your report that the waste is there and that it's there from the past. The recommendation is to make it more secure. The Chalk River project, the Chalk River already has waste in it, but you also have recommendations to restart that project and make it safer. Can you talk to us about that? Of course. This is a bit of a complicated topic, so I will try in French, but I might switch into English if it's too difficult. The waste at Chalk River right now is mostly waste that will be that is to say that there are a lot of buildings that need to be replaced, and they are creating waste, and so that's where most of the waste comes from. It's from the soil, the sand, and the old walls from old buildings. However, there was also waste that comes from various operations and external work that is not around Chalk River. For us, it's a question of monitoring what's happening. We want to know what's going to happen and how the waste will be captured appropriately when they arrive to the site. I will now switch into English because it's a bit too difficult for me.
So one of the big concerns is how is the waste going to be identified and placed into the near surface disposal facility, and how the wastewater treatment plant is going to be able to properly oversee and treat any leachate that comes off of that piece. So one of the recommendations we had made was for it to have an additional treatment for the wastewater. Chalk River had tested it, but they haven't seen the waste in action, and so they've gone with a system that is considered adequate, but it's not necessarily able to treat the waste in a efficient and effective way should the waste not meet their projections. And so we really asked for them to go and move up onto a more secure level of treatment so that any of the wastewater which will be placed into Perch Lake and drain into the Ottawa River doesn't reach the thresholds. We also asked for the thresholds to be more conservative, for it to take into consideration that this is an aquatic environment and it is also the drinking water source for Ottawa, Gatineau, and Montreal in many ways. Ottawa River is a major source of water for Montreal. And so we wanted those thresholds to be a little lower and that monitoring be done in a more proactive and robust way. There's a lot of data available about radioactive waste at Chalk River. Unfortunately, it is only available in the environmental reports or through the independent monitoring project that CNSC, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, puts out. And that data is not very robust and it doesn't capture what is happening. There's some good news here is that Ottawa, the city of Ottawa, a municipality, tests the water weekly for radioactive waste. And so that's where we get some of our best data about the radioactive materials that might pop up in the Ottawa River throughout the years.
pour ces éclaircissements et merci pour votre travail.
Thank you for clarifying that, and thank you for your fantastic work. It's all very scientific. Thank you so much. Mr. Frey, I do have a question for you. We talk about agriculture a lot at this committee. Farmers in my riding are very aware of climate change. They do cover cropping, and yet there's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of concern with regards to land water. There's less and less water in the United States, for example, in the Southwest. We were talking about the Canada Water Agency. What can we do? I feel like there could be a partnership with the farmers. We really have gone beyond the 6 minutes, Ms. Chatel. I'm sorry we won't have time to get the answer now, but it can always be included in a different answer, maybe during another question. Ms. Posey. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here and participating in this study. Ms. Holman, I have some questions for you. Your organization supports Algonquin Anishinaabe communities. They say they were never appropriately consulted for the Chalk River site. They will be here tomorrow in protest. I'd like to get back to what the mayor from Lachine told us. She was here last week. She is responsible for water, and she is a spokesperson for the metropolitan community. She says that once they determined that there was radioactivity, there was absolutely nothing to eliminate it or to mitigate it. I thought of that when you earlier mentioned the water purification plants. If we're taking position with the First Nations, and the entire First Nations Assembly said they were against it, hundreds of municipalities said they were against it, do you have a clear message for us with regards to the risks of this project in the at the Ottawa River on its health? And are you waiting for any leadership from the government's part? Thank you for your question. Thank you for recognizing the Algonquin and Anishinaabe communities on our territory, which is the river, the Ottawa River watershed. That is almost the entire territory of the Algonquin people. The Algonquin voices are therefore very important. When they say that they were not consulted enough, I think we really need to listen what they're telling you and understand their experience. I know that it's not exactly what the Nuclear and Safety Commission said. They said in their report that they did consult those communities, but that was not the experience for Kabaweg and other communities. My job is not to ensure that this project works properly. That is the proponent's work. But here's what I can tell you. Look at how the rules are implemented. In those rules, what exists actually to protect water? Often, we say that we'll use precautionary principle. We don't see that at all in this project. Thank you. So, federal leadership on the precaution principle is not happening right now.
Some of the rules and some of the regulations, it's there. Mais on voit pas que c'est utilisé.
We don't see it used appropriately. So the International Atomic Agency also says that it shouldn't be built close to a drinking water source. Now a question for Ms. Livingston. We've been talking about the Water Revenue Agency for a while. I believe that we should have a mandate for it. Maybe it will be possible for your organization to do that because it's a very promising one. Would you be able to provide a structured plan in order to collect all of the available data? We have many witnesses that appear here, and we have so much data. So data from the federal government and federal bodies, from universities, from various studies, from NGOs, provinces, territories, and then categorize them according to, for example, watersheds, groundwater, aqueducts, detected substances, the contaminants, and so on. The Water Agency could do that. Would you technically be able to create this fantastic super tool that could categorize all of these things?
That's a big job. So inventorying the water data that is either collected by the federal government or commissioned by the federal government to collect was one of our recommendations for an action that the Canada Water Agency could undertake in the earlier stages of its development. Could our organization do this? We would need a lot more resources and a lot more staff, but on a smaller scale, we do this to a certain extent when we're building out our open data platform hubs in different regions in Canada. We look at the landscape. We look at who's collecting data, specifically water quality data, I should say, and how it's formatted, the level of accessibility that it already has, and what level of effort would be required to format it in a standard way and share it on our open data platforms. So our recommendation would be scaling this up to a much larger extent at the federal level, looking, as you said, all levels of government and jurisdictions. So we could certainly provide some insight into how we've done this from our experience. And then in terms of whether we could take this on ourselves, I would say that's a separate conversation.
Merci, Monsieur Blakey.
Thank you. On to Mr. Blakey for 6 minutes.
One of the reasons why it's of interest to folks around this table is that when we think of the federal government and we think of big IT projects, we tend to think of the Phoenix Pay System and the Arrive Can app and other things that really haven't worked very well. So seeing that there's already success and there's already models out there that are working, and I think is an inspiration, and it's one of the reasons why some of us anyway might be more interested in seeing organizations like yours get the resources that they need to scale up instead of asking a new federal agency to start from scratch on a new system with all the financial hazards, among other things that represents. So I guess my question is along a similar line, which is just like, how do you imagine the relationship between your organization and data collection and presenting organizations like yours across the country with the new water agency? What kind of relationship do you think would be the best kind, both in terms of from the point of view of getting that kind of product where people can go and access that information at their fingertips in a more comprehensive way, but also in terms of governance, like what is important to your organization to be able to maintain in terms of its own self-governance versus a more integrated approach with whatever the new authority might be. If you could just give us a sense of what you think are important for policymakers to bear in mind in that process.
Sure. Well, you pointed at some really important elements just in phrasing your question. So one is the importance of having really strong enabling policies behind the systems before they're developed, looking at who's collecting the data, what formats it's already stored in, what systems it's already shared on, and how those systems could potentially work with each other. And as you said, also looking at what would be required to scale up these systems that already work. And so grading data based on whether it's accessible at all versus already openly accessible, and then understanding where to prioritize efforts. And then I would say another thing, and something that we've seen in our own work, is we work in different regions across Canada, and as I said in my opening remarks, people are sharing their data in very different ways across jurisdictions. So just understanding the contextual nuance and being able to provide supports that are more place-based depending on how people are sharing their data, whether that's in the Columbia Basin or Atlantic Canada or in Quebec. And one final thing I would say is looking at using different types of data standards as well, so that people who want to go and use that data, so it's not just a place for people to put the data that they're collecting, but so that it can be activated and used in things like modeling. We've heard from Akwanti before. There's other people who really want to harness the data and make sense of it for watershed reporting and that type of thing. So just making it as easy as possible for people who want to make the most of the information that's being collected and the most of the investments that have been put into the monitoring in the first place.
Someone who's done work with kind of community-led data gathering exercises, would you say that there are some important principles that should be manifested in the policy?
For data sharing?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are different sets of principles for open data. DataStream follows some of them. The FAIR principles for data sharing to ensure that it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And there are also principles for the governance of Indigenous data. And so at DataStream, it's an open data platform. We work with people who want to share their data publicly. So that's a really important distinction to make as well. In some cases, there are data that aren't necessarily appropriate to be shared publicly. So just looking at the principles that exist and making sure that they're embedded in the policies as well as in the systems and the technologies. And that also goes without saying in terms of building relationships with data holders and data collectors and the people who are using it as well, applying those principles at every step of the way.
Thank you very much. Do I have a little more time, Mr. Chair?
About a minute and a half, I guess. A minute and a half.
Okay. In Pinawa, Manitoba, we have a decommissioned, or it's going to be decommissioned, research reactor. And there's been a lot of debate around how best to decommission that reactor. One of the proposals is to disassemble it and move the waste to Chalk River, I believe. The other is to grout it in situ, and there's been a lot of concern raised about what that could mean for groundwater and ultimately contamination of the Winnipeg River system. I'm just wondering if there, given your work, Ms. Holman, if there's any kind of important cautionary tales that we should heed when it comes to figuring out how best to decommission this reactor and how best to care for the groundwater and ultimately, the potable water that comes out of that system as the debate continues.
Oh, and it can be a very, very busy debate as well. Ralphton, which is a reactor that is just upstream from Chalk River, the proposal is to keep it in situ. There is a lot of concerns around that process and how effective that is. I would also double check whether the materials from that site would make it to Chalk River, because we have been assured that no more additional waste would come to Chalk River. And so depending on the level of radioactivity of that material, if it's intermediate or high level, it would need to go into a permanent
Thank you. Mr. Leslie.
I'll start with you, Mr. Morrison. Am I good? I'll start with you, Mr. Morrison. I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight that today is Canada Agricultural Day. And while some folks seem to want to blame Canadian farmers for any environmental woes, I'd like to say how proud I am of our strides in sustainability across all aspects of our agricultural sector. And I know we'll continue to do that and be a world leader on that front. Just in terms of the projects with Akwanti, what has the interest been from livestock producers in terms of, well, I assume there's got to be some testing on the ground. Has there been any concerns surrounding that? What has the uptick been in the actual data outcomes of some of the projects that you've had ongoing? And can you explain what the tangible outcomes could be for producers with some of this data and modeling?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the nod on Canada. Very pleased to be here today on that. To the uptick of the beef producers, we've been we have beef producers among MFGA, so we're able to access their infrastructure. And also, we've also had Steve speak to the Canadian Cattlemen's Association as well. So there's been tremendous interest. And where we are with the model right now is we're just starting to really give it the ability to go into those more tangible results. It was always there. It takes a little bit of time, but we're at that time threshold now. We have a portal running the forecasting tool that allows producers to actually access our portal on our mfga.net and be able to tell what the water is coming downstream, both in short-term and long-term intervals. So it's a tremendous planning tool, both in long and short-term, especially in areas of southern Manitoba that are fraught with incredible extremes of water at some parts, and then of course with the dryness associated with drought conditions as well. So those would be the kind of the two. Steve, would you have an answer as well?
Continue on with you, Mr. Fry. What do you say is short and long term? Like, is this at a field level? How big of a scale, both in terms of timeline and physical geography, are these models kind of able to provide? Is an individual farmer going to say, okay, I got this section of land over here and I can anticipate based on this modeling that we are going to be in a continued dry spell or whatever the data would point to?
Yeah, that's exactly where they're going. So one of the strengths of that development that we did collaboratively with MFGA was it was a model designed with the producers in mind. So they actually had a seat at the table. When we designed the model, we designed the interface. How are they going to use it? They were there working with us all the way through. And we're at the point now, although we're modeling 155,000 square kilometers of the Assiniboine River Basin, an individual producer can go down into a section and get insights on changes in soil moisture, changes in groundwater levels over what we would say short term, which is 7 days, and then 30 days, kind of a longer term looking forecast. Now, hydrologic forecasts are as accurate as the weather forecasts, and maybe a little less accurate. So it's an emerging technology, but weather forecasts get better. And when that happens, hydrologic forecasts get better. And I think we have to condition producers and work with them to design tools that they can use when climate change has more and more of an impact on their operations.
Yeah, thank you for that, and I appreciate the recognition that I'm, early phases. So I imagine looking backwards, it's tough to tell how accurate it would be. Couple questions: is this a subscription type service? Like, I know this is a government, provincial, federal funded project to begin with, and I'm sure some contributions from other partners. Is this going to be a subscription type service that farmers can choose to employ? And I think, like, from benefits, if you're pretty confident you're going into a dry year, you want a drought-resistant seed that you would be planting, maybe outside of the forage side of things, but this, I think, could be used a little bit more broadly than just forage and grasslands. Is that kind of the model that you see this developing into?
So I'll make a quick comment, and then I'll pass it on to Duncan. It's, at this point, I don't think targeted for individual producer subscriptions. It's more of, like, if you're a watershed district, you could use this tool and then have your producers just access the tool through the watershed districts accounts. Like, obviously, someone has to pay for it. It's running in the cloud as we speak. But yeah, that's, so maybe over to you, Duncan, for
we have about 15 seconds.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I'll do it very quick. Absolutely. Our marketing strategy is to get it into the hands of the most amount of producers, the least amount of moves. So that means we're working with groups like the watershed districts so that they can use it for their staff and also get it into people in their jurisdictions.
Perfect. Mr. Vancouverden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all of the witnesses today for coming. I apologize for my funny appearance, but I'm grateful for the technology that allows me to do this from home as I recover from my little eye surgery today. But don't worry, to my friends on committee, I'll be back in person on Thursday. So my question is going to be related to the What We Heard report, which is the document entitled Toward the Creation of a Canada Water Agency. It's all about public and stakeholder engagement. So I'm mostly preoccupied with freshwater protection and conservation from a human and animal health perspective, which obviously includes agriculture and food security. So I also want to give a shout out to farmers and agriculture workers across our country. So participants have highlighted in that What We Heard study the need for more baseline data at a watershed scale to support assessments of new development proposals. They also told us that more research, monitoring, and modeling is needed to anticipate and track climate change and other threats to freshwater quality, quantity, and the and the health and functioning of ecosystems, particularly around freshwater, including floods and drought prediction. So on other panels, we've explored the fact that here in Ontario, we have the benefit of conservation authorities, which is a unique model in Canada that might be replicated precisely to learn from best practices and reduce some redundancies. So would any of the panelists today like to comment on science gathering groups or agencies similar to, or even a specific conservation area or authority in your region that has done some particularly exceptional work as it relates to human and animal health in freshwater?
I would be happy to jump in on that one if that's permitted.
Of course.
So in the Ottawa River watershed, there are conservation authorities. They are present on the Ontario side, but they are not consistent across the Ontario side because it is up to the municipalities to decide whether they're going to fund conservation authorities or not. And so in the northern part of the watershed, where we have a large agricultural belt around Lake Temiskaming, there is no conservation authority, so there is no drought forecasting that is done in that region. And then on the other side of the river, we have the Organismes de Bassin Versant, which are OBVs for short, which do a lot of research on it, but they don't have similar funding and they don't have the same powers that conservation authorities have. And so I think when looking at these models, there are even within the models themselves, there are some discrepancies about how effective they can be when they're not applied throughout the entire watershed or regions that they're looking at. In addition to that, with the data availability and the lack of consistent data being collected, it's very difficult to do analysis if you're not collecting data consistently from year to year. And so we have within an Ottawa Rivershed report that we did this concept of a slipping baseline, the fact that you collect data at a certain time, and if it doesn't exist previously, we have to look at the conditions today, as opposed to what they look like 30 years ago, which would give us a sense of what are the impacts of climate change, what are the impacts of pollution, and that all stems back to, therefore, what are the stresses on the aquatic health of these rivers, and how do we move forward to protect them? I think it's an excellent observation, and there's some really good models out there. But of course, as a watershed organization, I would really strongly advocate to consider the value of community-based monitoring and citizen and community scientists who can help gather that data and provide that localized knowledge that is so critical to understanding what might be happening. And we take the time to actually analyze the data at a watershed scale and provide that feedback, which is not necessarily done just when data is collected.
And thank you for that. And thank you for highlighting the very unique example of the Ottawa River that not only flows through different jurisdictions, but actually has a north shore in one province and a south shore in another. Is there anybody from another province or territory that would like to comment on an agency or science gathering group that's done good work outside of Ontario?
We have about 30 seconds.
Okay, it's too bad. I would like to speak to that just because in the Columbia Basin, we're moving from to a semi-arid conditions. And so we've been working for the last 7 years to collect and fill water data gaps to allow for a water budget to be built so that our community decision makers can have the opportunity for climate adaptation options. And so we've been working on this for the last 7 years, like I say, with an open source data hub. And Paige, I don't know if you want to speak to how many hydrometric stations we've been able to install.
Maybe you can just give us a number because the time's up, really.
For sure. We've got over 130 monitoring sites established here in the Columbia Basin through our program.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Madame Posé for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, merci.
Thank you. I will make a small introduction for Ms. Holman and Ms. Livingston, but it will be the same question. Ms. Livingston, in your notes, in your opening remarks, you said $73 million in water study, and yet the data is still not public. I can't believe it. There's money there, but we still can't seem to work together. As I was saying earlier, Ms. Livingston, if you have the necessary resources, it would actually be possible to collect all of that data and analyze it. Ms. Holman, in your brief that you submitted, you say that there are many gaps with regards to the data that can be filled through collaborative efforts. So collection and transmitting data as well. So question for both of you. Would the Canada Water Agency be a solution with regards to the lack of data for freshwater?
A minute for both answers, so.
Okay, I can be brief. Yes, absolutely. I think the Canada Water Agency, because it's the only organization looking at water from a national scale, is really well placed to look at what information and data is already out there being collected either by communities or by other government departments, agencies, researchers, and academics in order to pinpoint where some of those gaps are, especially looking at the freshwater issues that are transboundary and interprovincial and interterritorial in nature.
And I would just quickly add that so far what we've heard about the Canada Water Agency is this emphasis on government and academic relationships in solving many of these questions that have to do with fresh water. And again, would just like to highlight the value that watershed organizations can bring to these conversations and highlight localized issues, because we have people who live in these areas and we have connections with many communities and Indigenous communities who really need to be at the forefront of these conversations as well.
Je vais me permettre un petit...
I'll allow myself a little comment since I have 10 seconds left. You say that the Canadian Water Agency will do this and that, but you seem to know more than we do because it's barely been implemented. Everybody comes here and says, oh, the water agency is doing this, that, and the other, but everybody wants to impose a mandate. I just wanted to comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Hartwig, I just wanted to come over to you and ask, as the new Canadian Water Agency gets set up, what do you think are some of the potential pitfalls that may, that it may run into, that it should be looking to avoid in terms of approach? And what do you think are some best practices that it should look to adopt in order to create the best possible relationship with the existing network of organizations that are doing important work in the water space, and to ensure that it's adding value to that network instead of starting to compete with various elements of the network on work that's already being done?
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I think it's an important one. We don't really have time for the luxury of silos anymore. I think that we need to meet communities and groups and work that's being done where it's at, and then augment that and work off of that. And we've already been doing that in terms of some of the data hubs that you see being spoken about, like DataStream and the Columbia Basin Data Hub that we've worked on for the last 6 years to collect and have a repository for data that's been collected by people in our communities for our communities. So, and I think that dialogue seems to be taking place. Yeah, the sense of urgency is I can't tell you how concerned we are with droughts and flash droughts and long-term projections. One of the things that I think we haven't spoken about very much with the Canadian Water Agency, that the data collection strategy is one thing and data standardization is one thing. I think the problem will be when we have multi-jurisdictional gridlocks and where the rubber is going to hit the road in local communities. For example, the Columbia River wetlands where I live, it's the most important migratory flyway remaining in North America, 150 kilometers long. It's a Ramsar designated wetlands. It has no less than 98 management plans and policies that are currently meant to be applying to that wetland area. So I feel like that's going to be a challenge. And so multi-sector tables to help problem solve will be necessary. We do need to have these paradigm shifts. I feel like the Canadian Water Agency or Canada Water Agency is a really good step in that direction. And I think it behooves us to look to our neighbours to the south and the EU in terms of some of best practices being done there.
Thank you. Monsieur Deltel.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Ms. Holman with regards to Chalk River. On the government's site, there is the nuclear citation. I'll quote, there is a law on nuclear safety, the must broadcast scientific, technical, regulated information on the atomic nuclear issues. Do you feel that that was done correctly for the Chalk River?
I think that this commission is doing correctly its job.
So there's many different parts of the CNSC for doing its work, and there's many different projects that they're overseeing. They are a regulator, and they do report to a minister for their decisions and whatnot. It's really challenging to understand how some of these decisions are made based on the lack of transparency about how the process happens. And as an organization that has intervened on multiple occasions around what's happening with Chalk River, we don't always feel like interveners are heard in these processes. It's a very challenging subject matter to properly grasp and then be able to provide critical feedback on. And so there's a lot of improvement that can be done with the CNSC, definitely, even just in proper oversight and how licenses are provided for such long periods would be, one step, and sharing more information about how these decisions are made when they're reevaluating them.
But by the law, they have the obligation to give information and to spread it, not talking about pas d'avoir d'opacité par rapport à
there's no transparency with regards to the information. If I understand correctly, they're not broadcasting the information correctly. If you look at a project, we look at what has been proposed. For us, it's really about the impact on freshwater and how that has an impact on the Ottawa River. I can speak more to what can be done to improve the situation.
New radioactive waste policy that is coming into play. I think there's a lot of room for improvement for these types of policies to be able to provide the correct oversight. Oversight is the key here. These facilities exist, and the waste needs to be dealt with in appropriate ways. There is a lot of improvement that could be done.
So there is a lot of job to do to be more transparent.
Yes,
thank you so
very
much,
much
Madame.
So.
Alors, Monsieur le Président, comme vous le savez,
as you know, last Friday I tabled a motion. I'll read it. The Liberal government will be considering that there are increasing tax increases and more recourse to food banks, Canadians cannot take on more tax increases. Minister Guilbeault said that they don't take into consideration how the carbon tax impacts the carbon tax impacts their revenue, and we are doing less with regards to climate change. One must recognize that the carbon tax is not an environmental plan, but a fiscal one. The report must report on this to the House. As we know, Canadians are having a hard time making ends meet. Taxes are going to be quadrupled after April, and that will be a horrible idea for Canadians.
Thank you, my colleague, for bringing this important motion up. I think the committee and all actually the witnesses here can really benefit from this. The carbon tax scam, I guess we're calling it. We're finding out they're not measuring the amount of carbon tax that the tax is actually reducing emissions. And I think that was probably the biggest finding that we found out here in the last couple of weeks. And this is costing, especially rural Canada, the carbon tax, like $1 billion in the sea if they don't cut out the carbon tax for space heating for barns and carbon and for green drying as well. So it is imperative that this carbon tax stops. Canadians can't afford any more taxes. It's quite evident. We've got
point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Van Couverden.
I question the relevance of talking about the carbon tax while we're studying freshwater.
It's because there's a motion. There's a motion, and so it's. Mr. Mazur can continue. It is a motion about the carbon price on carbon. Go ahead, Mr.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just reiterate what we're asking the committee to consider. The committee call on the Liberal government to cancel their planned tax hike on April 1st, 2024, abandon their plan to quadruple the carbon tax to provide Canadians financial relief on the gas, groceries, and home heating. Acknowledge that the carbon tax is not an environmental plan, it is a tax plan, and the committee report this to the House. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Sorry, I was speaking to the clerk, so you finished your comments?
Yep.
Yeah. Mr. Field.
I move to adjourn debate, so we can get back to the witnesses.
Okay, we'll have to vote on that.
Motion to adjourn debate. Mr. Ali?
Mr. Ali, there's a vote going on here?
Hello?
Mr. Ali, motion to adjourn debate.
Yes, okay.
Madame Chatel? Mr. Longfield?
Yes.
Ms. Taylor-Roy?
Yes, certainly.
Mr. Vancouverton?
Yes.
Mr. Dadtel?
No.
Mr. Cram?
Opposed.
Mr. Leslie?
No.
Mr. Mazur?
No.
Madame Posey? Mr. Blakey?
Yes.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
Okay, so Mr. Longfield, take us home.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'd like to ask some questions to Ms. Livingston and Mr. Frey around data and the usability of data. In my previous life, we had remote machine condition monitoring that we put on machines around Canada. We would get a text message if a paper machine in Alberta was running too hot, or we would get another message actually from an oil rig in Dubai to say that the vibration was excessive. There are ways to monitor things, but then also to get notifications when data is showing that a condition is changed to the point where somebody needs to take attention. We asked the Imperial Oil to give us data on the wells up in Curl and where there was a spill, and they gave us pages and pages of columns and rows of data, just numbers. It wasn't usable to us or anybody else. The Alberta Energy Regulator was supposed to get a report when things were out of condition. We were supposed to get a report when things were out of condition. No report happened. So when we talk about data and the usability, Ms. Livingston or Ms. Hallman, is that something we could reasonably expect if we asked for it, to have usable data?
Yeah, I think it's a reasonable request. The amount of effort that would be required to make data that is out there usable will vary, obviously, but it is, otherwise, what's the point of collecting the data? So that's one of the things that we have spent a lot of time thinking about and doing, is really just kind of the in-the-weeds grunt work, really, of taking data in all of its forms, whether it's in a PDF document or if it's in an Excel sheet, as you said, different rows and columns, and bringing it together into one format so that people who want to make sense of it, who want to analyze, interpret, and synthesize it into reports that policymakers and communities can understand, it's a lot easier. I have a fun fact for you. There's sort of a rule of thumb that says that researchers will spend, between 60 to 80% of their time just cleaning, formatting, and making data usable. So just really harnessing the people who are out there trying to do this and make it easier for others to use is an important priority, I would say.
So again, Chief Takaro in my recent conversation said, can the kids go swimming? And who can tell me whether the water is good enough for the kids in my community to go swimming? If the water sensors had Wi-Fi and were putting data out, then there could be a yellow, red, green indicator for community members to easily see whether the water was safe for swimming, as an example.
That's a really great example, and I know that SwimGuide is a tool that will take raw data and turn it into those types of results, and maybe Larissa can speak to that.
I just wanted to add with the question about the usability of data. It is a question around when government is collecting data from industry and they're required to report, why is that not a requirement to provide it in a digital format and that they provide it in a paper format? Because it renders it basically useless. And how do you use that data to understand cumulative effects? I'd love to have things like sewage overflows being identified when they're happening so people know that that's not a good time to go swimming, as an example of immediate pieces, but there's other reporting tools as well.
Thank you. And Mr. Frey, on you mentioned the decision support tools and whether organizations are the ones that take the data and make it into a form that people can understand, or whether there's license fees that are involved. Is there a model that you're leaning towards with your data, the data that you're using through Aquanti?
So we try and use data that's open source wherever possible, and then we'll clean it and reissue it as cleaned open source data. So Canada One Water, for example, we spent better part of 3 years, a team of probably 5 people cleaning national scale data. And it's going to be reissued as open source, readily accessible, clean data for hydrologic modeling.
And we had the monitors, so we made sure the data was clean, and we put it up on the net so that people could see whether their machines were operating efficiently or not. Maybe it's through the monitor system.
So that's a good point. That's actually the next generation of hydrologic prediction, where not only do models and prediction tools ingest raw data from real-time sensors that are run by the respective groups, but use that data to make decisions and issue alarms in real time.
Perfect.
And South Nation Watershed is an example, almost where we are. They're running real-time systems that will soon have alarms.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, this has been a very interesting discussion tying data to watersheds. I want to thank the witnesses. Members, we have a couple of very brief items of committee business. Thank the witnesses, I'm sorry. We have a very short discussion on future business. Do you want to break and go in camera, or do you want to just do it now in the open? We need a unanimous UC motion to, no? No? Okay. I'm told we don't. So I assume we're okay with just discussing? Yeah. So again, thank you for a very interesting input for our study. We really appreciate it. Thank you to those online as well. So we have to submit a budget for our travel to Curl. You should have received the budget. So I just need your approval to be able to submit it to the liaison committee. The dates would be May 13th, I guess, for 4 days. Is it 3 days? Or?
Yeah, 3 nights.
3 nights, 4 days, including travel from the constituency. Can I submit that? Oh, yes. Yes, Ms.
Yes, and I'd also like to submit a motion.
Yes, please. Could you read it?
Yeah. So that's in reference to our water study. I know it's unusual to have one of those that's in reference to the study we're doing, but that in reference to the water study, the committee hold additional 2 meetings after its 13th meeting to hear from witnesses, with each panel including 1 witness, suggested by each party as per usual, that the committee also hold a further additional 2 meetings exclusively dedicated to hearing from representatives of those provinces and territories able to attend.
Thank you. Is there a discussion, or can we go straight to a vote?
No.
Okay, I've got Madame Posé, then Mr. Cram.
Moi, je veux savoir, là, avant de dire oui, d'abord, on est...
Here's what I want to know before saying yes. What meeting are we at? Is it the 11th? Yes, the 11th. So, is there anything that we haven't talked about? Before saying yes, let's go on to 2 more meetings, is there anything else that we still have to dig deeper into? Besides, obviously, the fact that we can't invite every single organization that works on water. We've had a very good idea of what they have to say. But before saying yes to this motion, I really want to know what direction we're going in. It's really about extra witnesses. The commissioner would like to appear. We are also trying to invite someone to talk about the American strategy. Or it's an international water strategy in the United States that will align with what we are going to talk about on Thursday. Besides the 2 meetings with the representatives from the provinces, we can just do one if we don't have enough witnesses, but the idea is to have the opportunity to hear witnesses that we should hear. With regards to witnesses coming from various provinces and territories, or even from Quebec, at the very beginning, I talked to Mr. Champêtre from the Environment Minister in Quebec, and he said no. And they said that they just did not have the habit as ministers in Quebec to come here and present what they've done. They just said that this is not in their habits. It could be public servants, but if they don't want to come, then they just won't come. I agree. But if from certain provinces, territories, or Quebec, there are ministers from elsewhere, it won't be on an even playing field. I don't think it's minister.
I mean, Madame Posé says, well, we don't normally invite provincial ministers. I don't think you were looking at provincial ministers. You were looking
the water authorities.
Water authorities.
More about provincial jurisdiction, right?
More about provincial.
If we make a federal plan, how does that interact?
No, c'était pas l'idée, c'était pas d'inviter des.
The idea was not to get elected officials, representatives. I'll continue on with my questions. We do need do we need 2 meetings? There are 10 provinces. Quebec doesn't want to come. There are 9 left. It could be less. If some provinces that don't want to participate, then maybe everything will be done within a single meeting. We know that it's 2 panels per meeting, so that's 8 witnesses. That's a lot of people. So it's 8 witnesses per committee meeting. It could be 1 meeting and a half or more, depending on the provinces, or less. If no representative wants to appear, then we won't have those 2 meetings. For the meeting with public servants, that's great. But with the 2 other meetings, we're talking about 8 more. It's 2 meetings, 2 times 4, 8. So 8 panels, maximum. If it's we're at the end of our list, it could be just 1 meeting. We're not just holding meetings for the sake of it. Well, that's great. Well, I'm serious. So we should decide on when, because if today we say, yes, we'll have 2 more meetings plus 2 more meetings, so 4 meetings, when will we decide that just 3 might be enough? If we're looking for witnesses and the parties don't suggest any witnesses, and we don't have enough witnesses, well, the clerk and the analysts will tell us that we're done with our study. I won't lie, this is very difficult to do for us. It's difficult for us to find witnesses. Some of them just can't come here. It's difficult for us to find witnesses. There's a lot more of you. It's all of Canada. It's not just Quebec. At that point, you can just take the block's place at any time and have your meetings. Well, that's not the intention. There are some witnesses who are important to meet, such as the commissioner, who wants to appear. It's to give us some flexibility to do things correctly. The idea is not to extend this forever. So there were 2 that we voted on. We're at the 11th meeting now, so 13. So there's 2 left, and so 6 more meetings on freshwater. Yes, indeed. I think that's a lot. I understand. I feel like we're starting to inviting people to talk about their businesses and saying that they just want funding. That's enough. We've had enough of those. Well, there won't be any more on the water industry, any more witnesses. The idea is not to extend this just for the sake of it. It won't be necessary. We will spare the members. Any other comments?
Mr. Chair, I was just wondering for the budget for Curl, which dates did you?
14, 15, 16.
Thank you.
It's a break week. Anyone else? Should we go to a vote? On division? Ben. OK. On se voit jeudi pour une réunion qui va être très, très intéressante.
We'll see each other on Thursday for the international part. And I just wanted to remind you there's a vote tomorrow night on a bill that has to do with the topic at hand. Okay, meeting adjourned.